So today, we're going to dig into the surprisingly deep history of STEM education. And what you'll see is that it's a story driven less by textbooks and more by things like global power struggles, economic anxiety, and this constant, relentless push for innovation. All right, let's jump in.
A space race, a global economy, a microchip war. What is the one thing that ties all of these together? Well, the short answer is that every single one of them triggered these massive nation-shaping investments in how we teach science and math. You see, each event forced a really hard look at the country's future, and the conclusion was always the same. The answer wasn't just in boardrooms or on battlefields, but in our classrooms. And that's the core idea we're going to explore.
And that story really kicks into high gear during the Cold War. It all comes down to a single event that sent a shockwave across America and pretty much changed education forever.
Okay, so imagine waking up on October 4th, 1957, to the news that your biggest rival has just launched the first ever artificial satellite into orbit. That little beeping signal from Sputnik 1 was heard all around the world, and for a lot of Americans, it literally sounded like an alarm bell. This Sputnik shock created this incredible sense of national urgency, this fear that the US was falling behind technologically, which back then was a direct threat to national security. But here's the thing. While Sputnik was the spark, the fire had been building for a while. The US had actually been laying the groundwork for technical education for almost 100 years. You had the Morrill Act back in 1862 that created land-grant universities. Then the Smith-Hughes Act funding vocational training. And by 1950, we had the National Science Foundation. So Sputnik basically landed on really fertile ground, leading directly to the National Defense Education Act, a huge investment designed to win the Cold War, starting in the classroom. And this is where you start to see a pattern, right? History doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. The space race triggers the NDEA in 1958. Fast forward to 2022, and modern competition over things like semiconductors triggers the CHIPS and Science Act. The language might have changed from national defense to economic security, but the basic idea is exactly the same. Geopolitical pressure is a powerful driver of educational reform.
But, all this history happened way before we started using the term we all know today. So where did the word STEM actually come from? It's actually kind of funny. For years, the National Science Foundation used this clunky acronym, SMET. Just doesn't roll off the tongue, does it? Then, in 2001, an NSF assistant director named Dr. Judith Ramilly did something simple but profound. She didn't just reorder the letters to STEM. She made the case that it wasn't just a list of subjects, but an integrated strategy for solving real-world problems. And when you break it down like this, you can see what she meant. Each letter represents a different, but totally connected way of thinking. Science is all about explaining what is. Technology and engineering are about creating what can be. And math? Well, math is the universal language of patterns that ties the whole thing together. Okay, so if STEM is more than just 4 different classes, what does it actually look like when it's done right? Well, researchers have kind of boiled it down to 5 core principles that define what good, integrated STEM education is all about. First up, and this is the big one, is integration. This is the whole idea. Instead of teaching subjects in their own little boxes, real STEM education connects at least 2 of them to solve a single problem. It shows students how these fields actually work together in the real world. So, for example, a class might use physics, engineering, and math to design and build a model bridge that has to hold a certain amount of weight. Second, learning has to be tied to the real world. This means getting away from those neat textbook problems that have one perfect answer. It's about tackling messy, complex, open-ended challenges. The kind you'd actually face in a job. The problem itself is what drives the learning. Think less solve for X and more design a cheap water filter for a village with no electricity. The third principle is a focus on design. This is where you take all that knowledge and actually put it into action. The engineering design process, define a problem, brainstorm ideas, build a prototype, test it, learn from what went wrong, and then do it again. That whole cycle gives students a powerful, structured way to apply what they know and, just as importantly, to learn from failure. And that leads right into number 4, inquiry. So if design is all about building the solution, inquiry is about understanding the problem in the first place. It's the process of asking smart questions, figuring out what you don't know, gathering data, and then using evidence to make your case. It's basically the scientific method in action. And finally, you have teamwork. Let's be honest, major breakthroughs aren't usually the work of some lone genius in a lab anymore. modern science and engineering is a team sport, period. So this principle is all about collaboration and communication, tackling problems that are just too big and complex for any one person to solve on their own.
Now, this whole integration thing isn't an all or nothing deal. It can happen at different levels. Multidisciplinary is kind of the first step. Maybe you study the physics of bridges in science class and the history of those same bridges in social studies. Interdisciplinary is the next level, where you actually combine those classes to design and build a model bridge. And then you have transdisciplinary, which is where the project is so immersive that the old subject lines just disappear.
And all of this brings us full circle, right back to today. Those same fears of falling behind that fueled the space race, they're back. And the response has been the single biggest investment in American science and tech in generations. Just let that number sink in for a second. $81 billion. That's what the CHIPS and Science Act authorized for the National Science Foundation alone, just over 5 years. This is a massive, massive commitment, and it's meant to supercharge everything from basic research to developing the next-gen workforce. And a huge piece of that pie, we're talking $20 billion, is going to create a brand new division at the NSF. It's actually the first new one in over 30 years. It's called TIP, which stands for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. And its whole job is to get amazing research out of the lab and into the real world faster than ever before. But this act is about so much more than just microchips. It's this broad, sweeping strategy to strengthen basic research, build that innovation pipeline with TIP, invest in education from pre-K all the way through college, and, this is critical, to broaden participation and make sure STEM fields are diverse and inclusive. So after 150 years of legislative pushes and big shifts in how we teach, here we are. We're in a moment that has all these echoes of the past, but it's aimed squarely at shaping the future. This quote here is from a pretty famous 2007 report that basically sounded an alarm, very, very similar to the Sputnik panic. It argued that America's economic leadership was at risk and called for this massive national effort. The goal was so clear and so ambitious: find enough great teachers to educate 10 million minds. You could argue that the CHIPS Act is, in a lot of ways, the long-awaited answer to that call. And that really brings us to the ultimate question, doesn't it? From the land-grant universities of the 1860s to the Sputnik-fueled labs of the 1950s, we've seen again and again how national priorities can shape entire generations of innovators. So now, with this historic investment flowing into the system, the real question isn't just about whether we can catch up, it's about what new frontiers this next generation, armed with these new tools and this new way of learning, will discover for all of us.